Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand. Donald Trump's words from the White House Wednesday as the U.S. president lifted sanctions on Turkey, endorsed a deployment brokered by Russia, and chastised European allies for, as he put it, their unresponsive attitude to taking back jihadists held up to now by the Kurds in northeast Syria. Where does it leave the French, the British, who also deploy jet fighters and special forces to the area? More broadly, is it another nail in the coffin of NATO as we know it, an Atlantic alliance where 27 of 29 members are European, where the United States spends more militarily than all the other members combined? We'll be making sense of the mixed messages we're seeing out of Washington and the situation on the ground, where the Russian deployment continues, the ceasefire seems, well, tenuous at best, and where it's unclear where the last U.S. troops are actually headed there. How much have the last 2 weeks upended the balance of power in Syria and beyond? Today in the France 24 debate, what next after the U.S.-Syria pullout? Joining us, she's just back from the border area, Sarah Daniel, senior correspondent for French weekly magazine L'Obs. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to former French ambassador to NATO, Benoît Daboville, vice president of the Foundation for Strategic Research think tank.
Thank you.
She also joining us today, he's the executive director of the Arab Reform Initiative, Nadim Houri. Welcome back to the show. And from Istanbul, Onur Erim, chair of the Dragonmar Strategies think tank. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, a regularly scheduled NATO defense ministers meeting taking place in Brussels this Thursday with one issue high on everyone's mind.
We share the same opinion as our British and French colleagues, that the situation is not in line with the Sochi Agreement, and it does not offer a long-term political solution. But this question does remain on the agenda, on the political agenda, and on the international agenda.
Benoît Daboville, is this the worst crisis NATO has seen in its midst?
No, NATO has seen a lot of crises, including because of Turkey, Turkish Greece incident and so forth. But beyond the obvious humanitarian crisis, it is a political defeat for NATO, not able to prevent two allies. The Turks are the second army of NATO. And to fight, there is no way, contrary to some parliamentarians in France, to expel the Turks from NATO, and they play a very important role. There is 3 bases, 2 US, 1 NATO. There is nuclear arm, so.
Is the problem, though, with Turkey, or is the problem with the United States, which caught its partners
both
off guard with this sudden pullout of forces?
Yeah, we were accustomed with the US since Obama about those reversal, but now we have a deep confidence crisis, which...
Wait, explain to us, what was the problem under Obama?
It was when he stopped the raid on chemical plants in Syria. At the last moment, the French and the British were quite surprised. That it was in 2013. And it had a very, very, very deep effect on the confidence. And now we see, so therefore it is Trump. Of course, we know Trump is saying anything, including that the Turks were not on the beach of Normandy, that the
Kurds.
The Kurds, yes, yeah. And the Turks. And he said also, when he received the Italian president, he said, we are allied since the Roman time. So a child of 12 will understand that he said anything. But the problem is what we are seeing is the trend about the withdrawal of America toward its own...
Sarah Daniel, what was your reaction when you heard Donald Trump speak from the White House Wednesday?
Well, it was an appalling speech, and, from a person that doesn't really care about
foreign affairs. But this is true that the first president to really discard multilateralism was Obama when he didn't strike in 2013 Syria, who had used at that time chemical weapons. So in that respect, in that regard, it is not very different from the line Obama fixed.
Wait a minute, was he discarding multilateralism? I mean, I don't want to go over history because we have a lot to get through a bit here, but remember it was that vote in the UK Parliament where they said no,
yeah,
and then...
of course, in a way, but then he set those red lines himself. He said if chemical weapons are to be used, then we will intervene. And then he said that maybe it's not wise. And I think it's the same idea that Trump has, that America at some point has to withdraw from this area, from this region, which then, of course, poses the questions of the influence of Russian and how they... it's not America is great again, it's Russian is great again with Donald Trump and those decisions.
It's important to remind that he has done that against part of the Congress, including Republican, and against the Pentagon. And what he said about Mattis, he said Mattis, which was really the adult in the room for the European...
His former defense
NATO,
minister.
And the head of the general staff, and he said he's a overrated general, and I have won against ISIS.
All right.
Which is totally...
And we're still getting, after Trump spoke at the White House, mixed messages from his administration. Earlier in the day, before that NATO defense ministers meeting began, he was speaking at the German Marshall Fund think tank. Mark Esper, his acting defense secretary, said Turkey's unwarranted invasion into Syria jeopardizes gains made there in recent years. He even went further.
But I've also said that the direction of Turkey with regard to the alliance is heading in the wrong direction. On any number of issues, we see them spinning closer into Russia's orbit than into the Western orbit. And I think that's unfortunate. So,
Nadim Houri, what do you make of it? The president says one thing, his defense secretary says another.
The president has said different things at different times as well. Look, I think strategically it was clear, I think going back to that Obama moment, 2013, the U.S. was starting to pull out from the region. I think that was clear. The problem is they didn't do it in an orderly fashion. They did not prepare their exit. And they did not sufficiently consult with their allies. Now, I think the Europeans were procrastinating. I think the writing has been on the wall for some time in terms of northeast Syria. But Europe wasn't sure, and I think they had put themselves in a situation where they felt incapable of taking initiatives without the Americans. And this is a vacuum that Russia has filled very easily. What's really surprising to me, I mean, Trump has been saying he wants to pull out for more than a year now. It's just ultimately he pulled out, and for someone who considers himself the best negotiator, he pulled out in a disastrous fashion. He got nothing for his pullout. He could have at least helped his local allies get a better deal. He could have stabilized things. I mean, for me, what the really shocking thing is, how did we get to a point where the Kurds on the ground in northeast Syria, which are the allies of the U.S. and the Western alliance against ISIS, was end up at war and being attacked by Turkey, a NATO ally? How is it that the U.S. did not see this coming? And everyone knew this was going to come, so they had to sort of prepare for it. Find the magic formula. How is it that it got to that point of desperation at this point? I mean, this is really, to me, the tragedy in all of this. And just hearing Trump, talking about blood-soaked sand and so forth, I have to say, I mean, a lot of that blood-soaked sand is due to the U.S.'s disastrous intervention in Iraq in 2003. So I don't want to just be looking back, but to hear him say that, to not own up to the mess that they have created, the vacuum that they have created, is really just, I mean, he's just running his campaign in the U.S. But I think beyond the U.S. and beyond Trump's antics, there's a real question today, because Syria is actually in Europe's neighborhood. It's not in America's neighborhood. So the question today, and I've been asking this for many European capitals for actually at least a year and a half now, what is your Syria strategy? And often, we draw blank faces when we ask these questions.
Draw blank faces. Onur Erim, Let me ask you, you heard us discussing there the mixed messages out of Washington. The sanctions against Turkey have been lifted. Next month, President Erdogan, he's due to go to Washington. Will he be able to just get the red carpet treatment from the White House and block out the criticism?
I mean, whenever you have President Trump in the equation, it's all up in the air. You never know what you're going to face. I mean, he could say one thing, in the morning, as we all, witnessed, not just with Syrian, ordeal, but with everything else. And then he could be saying the exact opposite before supper. So we don't know. We presume that since it was an invitation by Donald Trump to the White House for President Erdogan, I would think he would have to hope for a good meeting. So he would say that he would set things up for that meeting to end on a good note, because otherwise, I mean, I can't think of anything else. And he has been toning his not criticism, but he has been toning his messages towards Turkey towards the positive. Oh, again, but it's Trump. I mean, he made what seemed to be a very positive statement for Turkey, for President Erdogan, and then he, in the afternoon, talked about his conversation with the so-called General Muslim of YPG. So with Trump, it's always up in there. You never know what kind of treatment you're going to get. But one would have to think, since it's his invitation, invited to his own house, namely the presidential house, it would end on a good note.
And what's your reading of what happened in that initial Sunday phone call a couple of weeks back, after which Trump announced the pullout of those U.S. forces?
There are a number of theories on this. I would think that till the very last minute, Trump or his advisors on the military side did not think that Turkey would actually go ahead and go through with the operation despite the U.S. And I think they waited till the last second to see if this was really going to come true. And at the point where they, I guess, thought that Turkey was going to go through with this and not going to stop, not listening to the U.S.'s advice on this, they decided to call it off and backtrack.
And what NATO? What's up? What next for NATO in your view, Onur? When you see the divisions, you heard at the outset of our show, the German defense minister openly critical of what was agreed to Tuesday in Sochi.
I understand. I think the problem that we need to look into more when it comes to NATO and its structure, or how it's holding together, we need to go way beyond the Syrian issue that is at hand in the last 2-3 weeks, especially. Trump has been heavily criticizing the financing of NATO and how this was always been burdened upon the U.S.'s shoulders in a very major way. I think that's where the real question lies, and that's, I think, what we need to examine to understand where NATO is right now or where NATO is going after today.
Benoît d'Aboville?
No, there is in December, there will be a meeting which will be very, very difficult because obviously with Trump, which is unpredictable. But there is a lot of issue between NATO and Turkey, which are not related with Syria. There is first the dispute over the oil exploration in the Mediterranean Sea, which oppose Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey. And there have already been incidents, and there could be more. You had also the buying by the Turks of Russian anti-missile S-300, which was really the beginning of the break between US.
How do you explain that? Why is that?
I think Erdogan considers that he is independent. He is playing a game with Turkey, which is important for geopolitical for him.
And he seems very relaxed about Turkey's future inside of NATO. No one's going to kick them out.
No, it's impossible. You have Article 2 of NATO, which says that the allies should have a kind of moral defend democratic issue, humanitarian. But nobody has been never mentioning this Article 2.
So NATO was formed during the outset of the Cold War,
yeah.
And it was formed
To keep, you know the motto, to keep the American in, the Soviet out, and the German down.
And now,
but now we are in a
it's
different.
been, we're going to be celebrating ahead of
different.
the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. What's NATO's future at this point?
I think they will try to escape the controversy by going on discussing space, cyber, and of course, Trump wants to ally NATO on his fight against China, and that will put the European in a very, very difficult situation.
All right, when we come back here in the France 24 debate, we're going to look at the situation on the ground in Syria. Sarah Daniel, you'll tell us what you saw and what lies ahead, both for the Kurds and also for those ISIS fighters they've been holding or still holding in some parts. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're seeing, the balance of power shifting very fast over in Syria. It's been a couple of weeks since Donald Trump has announced his surprise pullout of U.S. forces from northeast Syria. He's now lifted sanctions on Turkey as Russia has earlier this week brokered a deal under which the Turks will have control of a buffer zone inside of the Syrian border for now. We're talking about it with Sarah Daniel, who's just back from there, senior correspondent for French weekly magazine L'Obs. We're with former French ambassador to NATO, Benoît Daboville, vice president of the Foundation for Strategic Research, a think tank. Also with us as well is Nadim Houri, who is executive director of the Arab Reform Initiative. What's the Arab Reform Initiative?
So it's a new think tank looking at the problems in the Arab world and trying to propose solutions, particularly for this 2011 generation. The Arab world has been going through major changes, and we need to rethink a lot of things, from politics to the economic models to social issues and individual liberties.
All right, and from Istanbul, Onur Erim, chair of the Dragon Mars Strategies think tank. Welcome back to the show. Now,
thank you.
A representative of the Syrian Kurds was invited to the U.S. Congress on Wednesday, Ikram Ahmed, while letting loose on the Trump administration's sudden pullout from northeast Syria.
But you could have warned us that you were leaving. We could have prepared to defend ourselves. We know that Congress has power. We have faith in you. Help us.
So, Sarah Daniel, I'm going to read you two reactions, okay? First, that of President Erdogan in a speech he gave in Ankara saying, U.S. Congress members hosting Kurdish militants will pay the price when the time comes. And also the reaction of the Kurdish military chief just after Trump spoke from the White House on Wednesday, Mazlum Abdi, tweeting his thanks to Trump for brokering a ceasefire and his tireless efforts for, quote, stopping the brutal Turkish attacks and jihadist groups on our people. Your reaction to that series of tweets we saw?
Well, you know, it's been such a sad story to cover, being on this border, but in a way, I have to say, this could have been expected also, because and of course, US should have been very careful in the way it was going to pull out, because Erdogan was obsessed from the beginning by the Kurds, the Kurd question, the PKK, and of course what was happening in Syria. And it was not from previous months that he was obsessed. It's from the beginning of the Syrian war.
And what did local people tell you on the Turkish side of the border there?
Some Turks are of course very nationalistic, especially the Arabs who are on this side of the border, and they are very happy and they are chanting Ottoman songs, and they're very much behind of course Erdogan, because you have to understand that it has changed, all this influx of refugees has changed the economy, like for the child labor, and a lot of time the Syrians have replaced the Kurds in this low-wage labor. So it has made a big tension.
And how many of those Syrians do you think want to go back soon?
Well, of course, if they say, you can reach your houses and it's going to be secured, a lot of them want to. And actually, I saw quite a few of them, next to the border and waiting for the promises of Erdogan to happen, which may be more complicated than we think. But let's see what's going to happen in the next few weeks.
All right, the Kurdish-led SDF forces didn't wait for Donald Trump's statement to pivot. First, they reached out to Damascus last week. And in the wake of the deal in Sochi, the Kremlin Wednesday releasing footage of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu speaking by video conference with Kurdish military chief Mazlum Abdi to discuss Russian military patrols in northeast Syria. Tell us about Mazlum Abdi and what his options or his role is now.
Well, it's actually I don't want to go too much into that because it's very volatile, as we see. The ceasefire is not really implemented, and I don't like to make pronostics of things that I don't really know about. So, but I have to stress from what I saw, because that's really what I can talk about. It's that the Kurds that I've met extensively were very disappointed, and not only by the American attitude, but also the European attitude and the French attitude, because they say, yes, you have supported us, but still we fought your war against your constituents, the French ones, and also we kept them in jail, and now you have forsaken us because we don't choose to fight. We're like, if the Americans are not here, the idea is that we're going to pull out also. And so there's no really European or French voice, actually, on this matter.
When Donald Trump spoke Wednesday, he claimed that American forces defeated 100% of the ISIS caliphate during the last 2 years, and he also addressed this issue.
We also expect Turkey to abide by its commitment regarding ISIS as a backup to the Kurds watching over them. Should something happen, Turkey is there to grab them. Further, we implore European countries to come and take those fighters that the U.S. captured and bring them back to their countries for incarceration and for trial. Until just recently, Europe has been very unresponsive in doing what they should have been doing for a long time. Now is their chance to finally act.
Nadim Houri, does Donald Trump have a point that Europe has been unresponsive in taking its own nationals who are radicalized and are being held in northeast Syria?
I have to say, I rarely agree with Donald Trump, and on that point specifically, yes, I do agree with him. And we have called on Europe for now almost 2 years. Not just on Europe, but all countries that had nationals there, that the situation is unstable, and that for various considerations they should take them back. I should first note that the majority of the foreign nationals, of the European nationals, are actually children, and very young children, under the age of 5. It's actually easy to take them out, despite what politicians have been saying. We have seen other countries from Central Asia take back their nationals. How? Actually, the US would fly them out to a military base in Kuwait, and they can come and take them there and recuperate them. So logistically, it was feasible. For the children on a humane and basic rights level, it was essential because it's unhumane and very unfortunate for European values to keep these children there. And frankly, from an accountability perspective and even from a security perspective, it was the right thing to do. If each country took back its nationals, they could process them. We know, for instance, today that most European countries have very stringent laws for those who travel to join ISIS or not. They could prosecute them. And saying that Europe does not have the ability to process them through prisons, for me, is just shocking. I mean, if there's a problem with resources, you put more resources in the justice system. You put more resources in the penitentiary system. To think that somehow the Kurds in northeast Syria have the resources to hold all these foreign nationals is not only, for me, a human rights issue, but now we're seeing it's a security disaster.
I totally disagree. Sorry, I have to say that. But having spoken extensively with those people, you have to understand, I'm not talking about the children, because of course that's a humanitarian matter, but the other, and especially the women, who are very few of them regret what they they did. And actually, they are combatants, and they should be, held for treason. And then there was also a problem. Why shouldn't be?
But France has rule of law. Shouldn't there be due process?
But why in France?
Where were they radicalized? Where were they radicalized? They were radicalized here.
They were radicalized here, and so they committed the crimes in Iraq and in Syria.
Exactly.
And I can tell you, those were appalling crimes. So, in what name should we deprive the right of Iraqis and Kurds and Syrians to judge them, to hold them? And they were our allies. Of course, now it has been changing, and the Syrian Kurds are not going to be willing to hold them for us. And of course, some humanitarian organizations, as yourself, are going to say now, in the hands of this dictator, which is Bashar al-Assad, you have to take them back, and that's.
Benoit Daboville, the Belgian court said, you got to take you have
to be precise. First, we are speaking about French national.
Yeah.
Okay. Then those crimes were committed in Syria, in the Kurdistan, in Iraq. Therefore, we consider that they should be processed, especially in Iraq. And we are speaking with Iraqi too, and we have already begun the process. With
but are they getting due process? We saw that report last year in the Wall Street Journal how the French were effectively inciting the Iraqis to do extrajudicial killing of French nationals who.
No, I don't think that is true. We are trying to negotiate with the Iraqi to set a special court with European standard. Now,
Iraq has the death penalty.
But
can I just say something, because I think there are some factual inaccuracies, and I visited these camps since day one at least 7 times. Let's be very clear. We're talking about those who are actually detained in northeast Syria. Iraq, it's a country, they are actually being prosecuted. Right? I mean, there are issues, and Europe is sort of abandoning its opposition to the death penalty, but that's a separate issue. Let's talk about the ones who are in northeast Syria. Okay, most of the foreigners are children. There is no reason they should be there. They're actually criminally not responsible for anything. They were just born there. Let's take the women. The Kurds themselves, I actually don't want to deny the local authorities the right to prosecute anyone, and I definitely don't want to give a gift to these nationals. I want to see justice done. The Kurds themselves have been saying from day one, and we can go through registrations, from the SDF commander, whom I have met, to many others who have said, we don't want to prosecute them. If you actually look at the counterterrorism law in application in northeast Syria, 99% of the women would not be covered by the law. They actually have to prove that they have committed a physical attack in the area to be prosecuted. And most of the profile of the women, while many are very, very dangerous, there's actually no evidence that they committed physical attacks. They belong to a terrorist organization. Right. They were actually police forces. Whereas actually in Europe, European laws actually prosecute for mere membership, and we have many who have returned. The third point is really an issue of justice. I mean, what we are seeing, frankly, and what Europeans are doing, let's call it for what it is. Europe outsourced its problem to the Kurds, and they did their own Guantanamo because they did not want to invest. I mean, I told Europeans, okay, you want to prosecute them in northeast Syria? Then invest in a justice system in northeast Syria. I said, no, we cannot do this because this will upset the Turks. It's like, okay, so what are you going to do? France transferred 12 French men from Syria to Iraq illegally under the cover of night because they knew they were violating their international obligations, but they did not want to have their footprint on this issue. Whereas many of these 12, if they had been in Iraq and committed a crime in Iraq, that's not a problem. But most of them had not even been in Iraq. They just transferred them to Iraq, and they told the Iraqis, now deal with them. And when we met the Iraqi prosecutors, they said, our Iraqi counterterrorism law does not apply extraterritorially. But the problem is Iraq today doesn't care about these things. I mean, if you go and you sit in the Rusafa court in Baghdad and you see how they process these ISIS members, if you were a driver, a cook, or a horrible beheader, you all get the same sentence, which is the death penalty.
Noor, let me ask you, you heard in that clip Donald Trump saying, if there's a problem, quote, Turkey is there to grab them. Do you agree?
In a very close sense, yes. Because Turkey assumed the responsibility of the areas that it went in, kind of overtaking it from the U.S.-backed YPG forces. along with the Syrian National Army. In those areas, yes, I do understand that, but it's a very long debate. And let me just stick in one thing in here before we further go on. I know Trump is doing the same thing. I know most of, if not all of Europe is doing the same thing. What we are talking about here is not the Kurds. We're not talking about the SDF or what is now called SDF. We're talking about YPG, who is a formed terrorist organization by PKK. I am not saying this. The U.S. government is saying this. The U.S. House is saying this. The U.S. Senate is saying this. So let's call it for what it is. We're not talking or dealing or helping the Kurds. The U.S. has had the misfortune, starting with Obama, of supporting, harvesting, and financing a terrorist organization. Again, these are not my claims.
But before 2015, President Erdogan worked with the YPG. It's the PKK he had a problem with.
No. You are talking about one single visit, not by Erdogan, who has, when the YPG was not the way it was not even this formation. But let's put that aside. I mean, even if that is so, if Erdogan made a mistake, that doesn't make anybody else doing the same mistake. Let's be frank. Let's be open. And let us not forget, I know, and I'm not talking about you, I know ignorance is usually a bliss. However, only about 7 to 8% of Syria is made up of ethnic Kurds. And of that, only about 15% had ever supported YPG. Again, these are not my numbers.
And if the YPG moves beyond that 32-kilometer zone that was agreed to by Russia and Turkey and Sochi, will it be problem over?
Well, on the U.S. side, the U.S. has said that we're guaranteeing that they're the guarantors that they won't. On the agreement with Russia, Russia said the same thing, that they will guarantee that the YPG will not pass through the 32-kilometer mark. Now, Turkey has no say over and beyond the 32-kilometer. And if they do go over that mark, then on one side we have the breach of agreement with Russia, and on the other side we would have a breach of agreement with the U.S. So it's really their problem if they ever do cross the 32-kilometer mark.
All right, Russia, again, as we were saying in part one of our discussion, which has filled the void left by the sudden U.S. departure. Vladimir Putin consolidating his image as a global power broker by following up his Tuesday meeting with Erdogan with a two-day Africa summit in Sochi, attended by more than 40 leaders from across the continent. Russia, not a neutral arbiter, it's also a stakeholder in Syria, where it's got a naval base and actively supports the forces of Bashar al-Assad with boots on the ground. Putin, at one point on Tuesday, seeming to issue a veiled warning, which I guess you could interpret as a warning to both Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the United States.
Syria must be freed from illegal international military interference. The long-term stabilization of Syria in general can only be achieved, in our opinion, by observing Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
It's been a good week for Vladimir Putin, Benoit Daboville.
Yes, and a very bad year 2 years for NATO. Syria is a disaster.
How do you interpret that statement we just heard?
He just continued to say that he's the big stabilizer because he's really pushing the idea that U.S. is no longer interested to intervene, including imagine what somebody in a Baltic country could think about the kind of attitude of Trump. They are depending, the Poles are totally subservient to the US for their security. Now, if they realize that there is a question mark.
Yeah, so if you have one of those Baltic states which is borders with Russia.
Yes, and NATO has decided 3 years ago to reinforce. We have French plane in an airport in the Baltic, and we have soldiers, and all NATO people are going on exercise on the boats. But if the US is withdrawing without even talking to the ally, because they didn't talk to the ally.
But is it just one man, Donald Trump, and that, well, he'll pass, there'll be elections?
No, but precisely, I think that is the central question, is whether it is an accident of history or is it a trend which will continue and reinforce.
And what's your answer?
The second one, of course.
You think it's a trend?
It's a trend.
You agree with that, Sarah?
Yes, I think it's very comfortable now for the US to have Russia being a game, decide what's going on the Middle East.
But again, we saw in part one of our discussion how Donald Trump is at odds with not just the Democrats, but many Republicans on this, including his own Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, but again, look at what Obama did in 2013. So we'll see, of course, maybe if a new Democrat is elected, then that's yet to be seen, we will have some changes. But I don't think so, really, because now you've seen the countries are very much into nationalism and addressing their own constituents. And I think it's a trend for USA, and Russia has been doing great in this year. I mean, and now they're doing what they need to do in Syria. And look, even the Kurds, if you see it like that, had to turn to Syria and to Russia to be saved. And it's a Faustian pact, but they had to do it.
We are entering into a new world, really, for NATO. It's the basic. It's epochal change, and I don't really see how the Allied will deal with that.
The French and German leaders are talking about a European defense force.
We are speaking about strategic autonomy, which is different, which is complementary to, because NATO, the political NATO is in shambles now, but the military apparatus of NATO is still working and could and useful. So
I think what this crisis has demonstrated is very much the weakness of democracies and of Europe, and the strength of some of these dictatorships like Russia and Turkey. And even Iran has made some points.
Turkey, Honorarium will argue, rightly so, there are elections in Turkey. We just saw the opposition win the city hall in Istanbul.
I'm not even going to bother rebuttaling or answering that one.
But if you see how they deal with the Kurds in the southeast, I think it's very much.
But it's the self-inflicted weakness. I mean, this is actually what's really interesting in what happened in the region. Russia is not a wealthy state. Russia doesn't have money or rubles to spend in Syria. They're actually economically probably taking out more than they are investing. And militarily, Russia, compared to countries like France, the UK, or another, is not a superpower the same way it was. So really, it's a loss of confidence. I don't actually think it's a self-imposed weakness of democracies and of actually losing faith in the model that they have. I think what's going to be really interesting in the coming period, and I actually think the balance tipped in favor of Russia the day they actually, launched the airstrikes. When the Russians said, "We are here." At that point, it was game over in 2014. Syria had entered into a different orbit. And again, that was not that surprising because Syria historically was in the Soviet orbit and was closer to Russia. So you could almost think it's sort of a return to, post 1990s politics. What's really going to be interesting to follow now is how far and how big is Putin's ambition in the Middle East, in that sort of new vacuum. We're seeing, they're getting close to the Saudis. They're making deals left, right, and center. And can they actually propose somewhere else? The Middle East is tired of the Americans. If you actually look at any of the opinion polls in the Arab world, most people from sort of Morocco all the way to Iraq no longer want the US. They see the US involvement as having been a disaster overall. Russia is still an unknown. There's a sort of a freshness to it. So when you talk to people on the street, they like the image of Putin so far. How long will that last? And what will Russia be able to offer them? I think this is, for me, the big question mark. It's nice to host conferences, but is Russia in a position to spend money and to do investments? And so far in Syria, they have not been able to.
And Onur, we heard Vladimir Putin warning foreign forces to leave Syria. You just heard Nadim Houri talk about warmer relations between Moscow and Saudi Arabia. We've seen also with Egypt and of course, Syria. Those are not friends of Turkey.
No, I mean, I got to stand up and give a bow to Mr. Putin, especially in his international diplomacy in the last couple of years. He seems to be the only guy that could get along with everybody, especially in this region. He is also, which was very surprising to me, he was also able to see eye to eye with respect to the agreements between Russia and Turkey and U.S. and Turkey.
But how long will it last?
In the North Syrian border. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. First of all, I do disagree with all the comments, not by you guys, but that the U.S. has pulled out or is pulling out from Syria. They absolutely not. They're still showing having a big presence there. They're in the oil and gas rich area of the Dar Azur area. So they're not there to stay. I don't believe that there's going to be any 100% pullout. Plus, they got a lot of presence in Iraq and right in the southern area.
But you said at the outset of our conversation,
Onur,
you said at the outset of our conversation with Trump, he says one thing in the morning and another in the evening. Do you agree with the point made by Ambassador Daboville about how if you're a NATO member, which Turkey is, but with also countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are, you've got reason to worry with the U.S. as an ally today?
I'm sure they have a very maybe a justified concern in thinking that way, but I believe that everybody on the table knows that despite the objections from Germany and France, neither one can do much or anything in the area without the U.S. or Turkish logistical support and air coverage. So I'm pretty sure Russia realizes that. When it comes to NATO, or at least when it comes to Syria issue, what the U.S. will say will go as far as what's going to happen in the North Syrian area.
But I think we all agree that the balance of power in the Middle East is going toward, at least for the time being, toward Russia. But there is another game, is the fact that the U.S., both Democrat and Republican, the Congress is only concerned about China. That'll be their obsession,
and that'll be one for another debate. Sadly,
yeah, but it's important because that means that Trump is playing to its opinion, which.
Benoît Daboville, I want to thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank Nadim Houri, Sarah Daniel. I want to thank as well Onur Erim for being with us from Istanbul. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.